All right, so today we're going to try something a little bit different.
Okay.
We're going to take some really complex ideas and not just kind of wrap our heads around them, but try to understand them so well that we could explain them to a philosopher.
To a philosopher, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're really going to try to get down to those fundamental assumptions, the logic behind them, and then follow the implications.
I like it.
So for this thought experiment, the subject is Albert Camus.
Camus, okay.
Yeah, journalist, playwright, novelist, essayist, and often reluctantly he was called a philosopher.
Yeah.
Now, Camus, he really wasn't a systematic philosopher.
Yeah.
He was skeptical of like pure reason and really focused on personal experience,
Yeah.
especially in terms of like trying to understand the meaning of life
Right.
in the face of death.
Right.
And he was really tough to categorize.
Yeah.
He was often called an existentialist.
Right.
But he always said, no, I'm not that. I'm not an existentialist.
Right.
So that's our mission today. We're going to really jump into the core of Camus's thought.
Right.
We're going to try to understand it like a philosopher would.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to explore those paradoxes
Yep.
and trace how his understanding of the human condition kind of changed.
Yeah.
And the source material for today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
It's an incredibly thorough entry on Camus.
Good.
So right away, I was fascinated by this.
Okay.
Camus was challenging philosophy itself.
Yeah.
Like from within philosophy, he's criticizing it.
Right.
And he was really skeptical of theoretical systems, but he offered really strong opinions on the biggest questions.
He did.
You know, about existence.
Right.
So there's a huge tension right away.
Yeah.
He was really engaged in existentialism,
Right.
the whole meaninglessness of existence
Yeah.
and individual freedom.
Yeah.
But then he says, I'm not an existentialist.
Right.
And then you have his major works,
Right.
The Myth of Sisyphus
Okay.
and The Rebel, which on the one hand are skeptical that you can find any ultimate meaning in life.
Yeah.
But they also lay out what they consider to be objectively valid ways to approach a meaningless existence.
Yeah. I see that tension there.
Yeah, so it's like saying, okay, life is absurd,
Right.
but this is how you should respond. And
Right.
and if you connect this to the rest of his work,
Yeah.
you can see him criticizing
Right.
established religion, the whole course of modernity,
Yep.
including Marxism.
Wow.
But at the same time, he refuses to come up with his own philosophical system.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he uses these two concepts,
Okay.
absurdity and rebellion.
Absurdity and rebellion. Okay.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea of the absurd.
Okay.
Now, Camus, he was like Aristotle.
Right.
They both thought that philosophy started in wonder.
Right.
You know, that basic human urge.
Yeah.
Why are we here?
What is the meaning of all this? Yeah.
What's the purpose?
Oh.
But then Camus does something that is pretty significant,
Okay.
philosophically speaking.
Right.
He's like, there's no answer to that question.
Huh.
He's like, spoiler alert, there is no satisfying answer.
Wow. Okay.
And there's no scientific breakthrough. There's no grand design,
Right.
no comforting metaphysical reason,
Mhm.
not even something humans can come up with
That's interesting.
that can answer that question.
Wow. So we're left with
So basically, we're left with this like need,
right.
this human desire
Sure.
to find meaning.
To know the reason why we're here,
But the universe is silent.
but we don't have an answer, and it seems like there might not be one.
And the image he uses to show this is Sisyphus.
Sisyphus.
Yeah, he's pushing a boulder up a mountain
Right.
over and over again, eternally,
Uh-huh.
only for it to roll back down.
Just for it to roll right back down again.
So it's that relentless, meaningless striving,
Yeah, I see that.
reaching for meaning,
Yeah.
but it always escapes. So
Yeah.
this is where you get to the big question.
Yeah.
Was Camus a philosopher?
Right. Because
He was so critical of traditional philosophy.
right.
And he relied so much on metaphor and storytelling.
Yeah.
Some say that absurdist philosophy is actually a contradiction.
Uh-huh.
It's like an oxymoron.
Right.
But even Camus himself said that he thought in words, not in ideas.
Yeah, he considered himself more of a writer or an artist.
And he saw himself more as a writer, an
Yeah,
artist
yeah.
who was dealing with philosophical questions.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's important to point out
Yeah.
that Jean-Paul Sartre,
Right.
a pretty serious philosopher,
Yeah.
recognized right away how philosophical Camus' work was.
Right away he saw it.
And he connected Camus
Right.
with Pascal, Rousseau,
Uh-huh.
and Nietzsche.
Nietzsche.
So to really understand Camus' contribution,
Yeah.
you have to take his philosophical writing seriously.
Okay.
It's not about like conveying a mood.
No.
or just making statements without support.
Right.
There is a real method to his skepticism.
Good.
It's a rigorous exploration of the assumptions and where they lead.
Yeah.
But his style is not traditional.
I see that.
It's not systematic
That's
like
weird.
some philosophers would expect.
Right.
I think the best way to understand his work is to look at it as an attempt to demonstrate,
Okay.
not just tell us
Right.
the implications
Right.
of this absurd existence.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it boils down to two really basic questions.
Okay, what are those?
Why should I not commit suicide?
Okay.
Which is a question he asks in The Myth of Sisyphus.
Right.
And then the bigger question, why should I not kill others?
Ah.
Which is the central focus of The Rebel.
Yeah, those are huge questions.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the absurd,
Yeah.
this lack of connection
Yeah.
between our desire for meaning
Yeah.
and the silence of the universe.
Yep.
So where does Camus begin
Okay.
to build his response to this?
Yeah, where does he go from there?
I think we can get some clues
Okay.
from his early work, Nuptials.
Nuptials, all right.
Yeah, it was published in 1938
Okay.
and is considered his first philosophical writing.
Interesting.
Now, you know, Camus, he actually wrote his thesis on Greek philosophy and Christianity,
Okay.
but when he starts writing philosophically on his own,
Right.
he deliberately rejects religion as a basis for meaning.
Interesting.
So he's really exploring what it means to live authentically
Right.
without religion
In a post-religious world.
in a post-religious world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the style of Nuptials is really unique,
Okay.
almost poetic.
Uh-huh.
There's an intense focus on like the senses,
Okay.
like, you know, the feel of the sun on your skin,
Right.
the smells of nature.
Yeah.
It's a very visceral response
Yeah.
to the question of meaning in the face of death.
Wow, so he's really emphasizing those immediate experiences.
He's drawing this really sharp contrast
Yeah.
between these, like,
Between
the very real, tangible things and abstract religious ideas.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, you have these religious anxieties
Okay.
about pride,
Yeah.
the immortal soul,
Right.
the afterlife.
Uh-huh.
And then on the other, you have what he calls self-evident facts, that we are mortal
Yeah.
and this life is all we have.
This is it.
Yeah, and he basically says, well, if this is it,
Yeah.
then the idea of an immortal soul doesn't make sense.
Right.
And he just throws that out there.
Yeah, he doesn't really provide a lot of justification.
Yeah, he doesn't argue for it.
Right.
He just says it's self-evident.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, if he's not turning to religion,
Yeah.
where does he find wisdom?
Where does he go?
In this early work,
Yeah.
he talks about the conscious certainty of a death without hope.
Mhm.
That's a big statement.
Yeah.
It goes against
That's a tough one.
traditional philosophies
It
and
is.
religion.
For sure.
But for Camus in this period, wisdom is about looking death right in the face
Right.
without flinching.
Just confronting it head on.
Not taking refuge in illusions about immortality or transcending death.
Yeah.
He said there's no superhuman happiness,
Right.
no eternity outside of the curve of the days.
Yeah.
He even said, I can see no point in the happiness of angels.
Wow.
So he's really rooted in the here and now.
Yeah, so anchored in this life.
And because of this rejection of Christian hope for an afterlife,
Okay.
some people call him a pagan.
Oh. Oh, interesting.
But I don't think that's quite right.
Okay.
It's not so much that he's embracing paganism.
Right.
It's that he's rejecting hope itself
Harp itself.
in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
He calls it a disastrous delusion.
A disastrous delusion.
And he's echoing Nietzsche here.
Okay.
You know, Nietzsche's idea of Pandora's box. Hope is the last thing that comes out of the box.
It is, and it's the one that's the most troublesome.
And it's the one that causes all the problems.
Yeah.
So Camus is saying
Yeah.
that this idea of being rewarded in the future
Right.
makes this life less valuable.
It devalues what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, it's just a waiting room
Right.
for the next thing.
It's just a means to an end.
So his answer to that is pretty radical.
Okay.
He says, embrace the present.
Yeah.
Live this life intensely
Right.
without relying on some idea of an afterlife.
Yeah, just be present.
And he even says, I don't want to believe that death is a gateway to another life.
Wow.
It's a closed door.
That's a powerful image.
And what's interesting is that he finds something positive in this
Okay.
stark view of death.
Yeah.
It's not just bleak nihilism.
Right.
He's saying that by accepting that death is the end,
Yeah.
we become present to what is
So what's right in front of us.
the stones, the flesh, the stars,
Yeah.
those truths that we can touch.
Right.
And that leads him to find his present wealth.
His present wealth. Okay.
That's what he calls it.
Yeah.
The wealth of his current sensory experience.
Wow. So he's finding meaning in the concreteness of the present moment.
Yeah, and this acceptance of death.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to deepen his appreciation for very human things.
Okay.
Like our connection to the land,
right.
love and friendship,
Yeah.
a sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
These become the certainties.
The anchors.
The anchors in a world that's uncertain.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Nuptials really shows what life feels like.
Okay.
And what holds meaning.
Yeah.
When you take away the afterlife.
When there's no heaven.
Yeah. He has this beautiful line.
Okay.
In Nuptials at Tapasa.
Right.
Where he talks about fulfilling a truth that resonates with the son and his own death.
Yeah.
Embracing the fleeting present.
Right.
And being proud of the human condition.
Wow.
So this focus on the present.
Yeah.
On immediate experience.
Okay.
That's what sets the stage.
Yeah.
For his more developed ideas in the myth of Sisyphus.
Okay.
This essay, it's part of his triptych on the absurd,
right.
along with The Stranger and Caligula.
Right.
And it starts with this incredibly powerful line. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide.
Wow.
So right from the beginning.
Right away. Yeah.
He's changing how we think about philosophy.
Yeah.
It's not some puzzle to be solved from an ivory tower.
No, it's a matter of life or death.
It's a life or death question.
Right.
Should I keep going?
Powerful stuff.
And all of his philosophical questions come from the starting point.
This fundamental question, yeah.
Yeah. So he's looking at suicide as a direct consequence of the meaninglessness of our search for meaning.
Yeah.
The finality of death.
Right.
The fact that nothing lasts.
Yeah.
And then the futility of trying to understand a universe that doesn't seem to care.
A universe that's indifferent.
He even says that any attempt to explain everything through reason, any system, is enough to make a decent man laugh.
Wow. He doesn't pull any punches.
And then he introduces this idea of an absurd sensibility.
Absurd sensibility, okay.
Yeah. Which he calls an intellectual malady.
An intellectual malady, okay.
So it's this intuition that comes before any developed philosophy.
So it's like a starting point almost.
Yeah, and he's not interested in like proving the absurd.
Right.
He's interested in what it means for us.
Okay.
What are the consequences?
Especially the consequence of suicide.
And so instead of arguing for it, he tries to show us.
He illustrates it, okay.
He illustrates it.
Yeah.
And he even compares this to Descartes' method of doubt.
Interesting.
So it's like that starting point for inquiry.
Right.
You have to clear the ground first.
You got to wipe the slate clean.
And one of the ways he shows us the absurd is through the routine of daily life.
Right.
Like work, eat, sleep, repeat.
The daily grind.
And he's pointing out that it's a cycle with no inherent meaning.
Just going through the motions.
And he even mentions Sartre's nausea as another example of this.
Right.
So he's saying that reason has its limits.
It hits a wall.
When dealing with the absurd.
When we try to apply it to this.
And there's this frustration because humans want knowledge.
We want to know.
They want unity.
We want everything to make sense.
They want understanding.
Yeah.
But there's this gap
between
what we think we know,
and what we actually do.
And what we really know.
Right.
He says the world in itself is not reasonable. That's all that can be said.
So he's not saying that we should abandon reason.
Yeah, I don't think he's being irrational.
Right.
He's just recognizing that reason can only take us so far.
There's a limit to what we can know.
Yeah, so if suicide is one response to this frustration, and hope is another, whether it's religious hope in the afterlife, or hope in some great cause.
Yeah, like a utopian future.
What's Camus's alternative in the myth of Sisyphus?
Yeah, what does he propose?
He says to live without escape,
to
live in the state of revolt.
In revolt, okay.
Yeah, to embrace that tension of being human, to be aware of our limits.
Or mortality.
Our mortality, yeah. Without falling into despair.
Without giving in.
He says to die unreconciled.
Unreconciled.
And not of one's own free will.
Mm-hmm.
So he's calling for this lucidity.
A clear-eyed view,
A clear-eyed view of reality.
Right.
And a rebellion against meaninglessness and death.
That's interesting.
So he's drawing a parallel to Nietzsche.
Yeah.
They both start from the idea that God is dead.
Okay.
And they both want to face...
to confront,
the hard truths.
Right.
But Camus is actually pretty critical of existentialism.
Okay, so
Yeah, and that's interesting.
It is, because that's what he's usually associated with.
Because that's what people think he is.
Yeah.
But he says that existentialists like Kierkegaard and Jaspers and Heidegger and even Sartre, they recognize the absurdity, but then they try to escape it to find a way out.
In irrational ways.
Okay.
He says they deify what crushes them.
Wow.
And they find reason to hope in what impoverishes them.
So they're kind of turning back to a form of religion almost.
He thinks they're being religious without calling it religion.
Yeah.
And he's particularly critical of Kierkegaard's leap of faith.
Okay.
And Husserl's embrace of Platonic essences.
Right.
He sees that as a retreat into idealism.
So he's drawing some lines in the sand.
And this is where he brings in fictional characters.
Okay.
And the myth of Sisyphus to illustrate his ideas.
Yeah.
And it's really smart.
It is.
It's a really vivid and memorable way to make his points.
Yeah.
So Sisyphus, he has this eternally meaningless task.
Right.
Pushing the boulder up the mountain.
Just have it roll back down.
And he knows it's meaningless.
Yeah.
But he keeps going.
He does.
And Camus says that's a kind of triumph.
A triumph, okay.
And he talks about Sisyphus's scorn for the gods.
His hatred of death and his love for life as being what led to his punishment.
That's what got him there in the first place.
Yeah, but it's when he's walking back down the mountain to start the task over again.
To do it all again.
That he achieves this victory.
This is his hour of consciousness.
He calls it the hour of consciousness because he's fully aware of his situation.
He's not fooling himself.
Yeah, and Camus says this is the end point of absurd reasoning.
This awareness.
This tragic awareness.
Yeah.
So his answer to suicide is this full consciousness.
Okay.
Rejecting false hope.
Yep.
Refusing to submit.
Right.
And embracing life.
Even though it's absurd.
Even in the face of absurdity. Yeah. He says all Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein.
Wow.
His fate belongs to him.
Yeah.
His rock is his thing.
That's a powerful image.
And even within this framework, he finds room for happiness.
For happiness. Okay.
He says happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth.
Wow.
They're inseparable.
So they go hand in hand.
Yeah. It's not that the absurd somehow creates happiness.
Right.
But by recognizing the absurd, we also accept our limitations.
Oh, limitations,
But we also recognize
our desire to
transcend them.
Yeah, to go beyond
And he says this struggle, this engagement with life against the odds, that's what can fill a person's heart.
That's beautiful.
So he says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Imagine Sisyphus happy.
And this contrasts with other kinds of philosophical skepticism.
Okay.
Like Pyrrho,
right,
who thought that accepting death meant you should stop wanting knowledge.
You shouldn't seek certainty.
But Camus keeps wanting to know.
Yeah, he doesn't give up on that.
And that actually intensifies his drive to live.
Interesting.
And like Descartes, Camus thinks critical inquiry is important.
Yeah.
But he goes beyond just doubt.
He's not just doubting everything.
He's affirming life.
Right.
He's embracing the tragic and the sensuous.
The whole spectrum of experience.
And it's almost like the logician in him gives way to the artist in this acceptance of the human condition.
Beautiful.
Okay, so Camus' exploration of the absurd.
Okay.
It doesn't stop with the individual.
No.
He turns his attention to violence.
To violence, okay.
In The Rebel.
The Rebel.
And this makes sense, especially given his political activism and his experiences in World War II.
Yeah.
He had been involved in politics early on with the Communist Party.
Right.
He ran a theater company. He wrote about social injustice as a journalist.
Right.
And he was a pacifist at the start of World War II.
Right.
But then he joined the French Resistance.
He did.
And that experience really shaped his thinking.
I bet it did.
About violence.
Yeah.
And he wrote these letters to a German friend where he explores the justification for violence. And then he became the editor of the underground newspaper Combat.
Combat, okay.
And his novel, The Plague, kind of anticipates the ideas in The Rebel.
Right.
They're both about collective resistance, but also being aware of our limitations. Now, The Plague, it's been interpreted in many ways.
It has.
And the question of violence, it stayed with Camus even after the war.
Right.
He protested against nuclear weapons. He opposed the death penalty. And he was against Marxist revolution.
Wow.
So in The Rebel, he goes from individual absurdity to the social implications of revolt and murder. He says awareness of the absurd, when we first claim to deduce a rule of behavior from it, makes murder seem a matter of indifference, to say the least. And hence possible.
So he's connecting the absurd.
So he's connecting nuptials, where there's no God. The myth of Sisyphus.
Where life is absurd.
And now this new focus on revolt. In the rebel. And he says, I revolt, therefore we are. And that's a really fascinating statement.
Yeah. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, because how do you get from I revolt to we are? Yeah. How do you go from the individual to the collective? And how does that connect to absurdity and injustice? Yeah. Well, Camus, he doesn't like revolution. He prefers rebellion. He's against these Marxist utopian futures. Yeah. He thinks we should focus on the present.
On the now.
And he talks about measure, which means like
measure balance.
Yeah. And he connects this to what he calls a Mediterranean outlook. But he doesn't really explain that very well.
Yeah, I was going to say, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, so his critique of communism
it comes from a lot of places. His own experiences, his political views, and his philosophy. He was kicked out of the Communist Party.
He was.
And he was in the resistance.
Right.
And he rejected historical determinism.
Yeah.
And the idea that the ends justify the means. He says, in the Marxian perspective, 100,000 deaths is a small price to pay for the happiness of hundreds of millions.
That's a chilling statement.
So he sees communism as this revolt. That tries to control everything.
To control all of creation.
And he connects that back to the myth of Sisyphus. And this desire for order and unity.
Right.
And he sees the execution of Louis VI as this move towards justice without limits.
Towards a kind of dangerous absolutism.
Yeah, and he talks about logical crime. Which is when mass death is justified by some ideology.
Wow.
And it's interesting that he focuses on communism.
Right.